Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
This is the latest in our Summer Book Club series, where we're interviewing authors about books that we think will be of particular interest to listeners to the show. And today we'll be joined by Glen O'Hara, who's written New Labour, New Britain.
In this book, Glen reflects on the Blair Labour governments of 1997 to 2007 and zeroes in on what he regards as many of the domestic policy achievements in those governments. Of course, he also reflects on the failures, but I would say that this is a book which is an attempt to give the new Labour governments of Tony Blair one of their best, most evidence-based shots at arguing that they were successful governments that did truly transform Britain for the better. And nearly 20 years on since Blair left the Premiership and nearly 30 years on since Blair entered the Premiership, Glen O'Hara argues that we now have some of the benefit of hindsight and also the comparative data, and we can reflect on what came after the new Labour government as a way of providing some kind of assessment as to the strengths and weaknesses of those governments.
Here's our discussion with Glen.
So, Glen O'Hara, it's great to have you with us on Since Attlee and Churchill, and here to talk about your new book. New is in the title twice, New Labour, New Britain, How the Blair Governments Reshaped the Country. You've got your copy, I've got our copy here as well, and it was a great read. And to start us off, this book is an attempt in part to reassess the Labour governments of Tony Blair now after the passage of some time, 20 years. And you begin the book by reflecting on how there was a sort of moment in time when the Wilson and Callaghan governments had their reassessment in the 1990s, Ross McKibben's homage to Wilson and Callaghan and the LRB. And I wanted to ask you a bit about how we remember Labour governments. It seems to me that at the time when we have Labour governments, those who are on the sort of Labour side of politics tend to spend most of our time complaining about the Labour governments. And as time goes on, we then become somewhat more rosier in our picture of those governments. And I have to say that even myself, you use this term Blair derangement syndrome. I can identify with that. When I was a teenager, I couldn't stand Tony Blair, and I was very much a Brownite against the Blairites, and I joined the party under Brown, but under the proviso that I, still didn't like Tony Blair. And yet, as time's gone on, I've come to respect Tony Blair more. Still many things I disagree with him on, but I've come to see his premiership as more, as you say in the book, more pluralistic than I think I had appreciated at the time. That I've come to really respect Blair as a generational talent in terms of political communication and leadership, when at the time I was criticizing some of that on the grounds of spin and superficiality. So is there something about Labour and nostalgia that makes us particularly prone to look back at governments with rose-tinted glasses? Or is there something about Labour which makes us, in the moment of government, more hypercritical of a Labour government than perhaps Conservatives might be of their own government?
Well, how long have you got? It's the first answer, because that's a very rich description. And thank you for the summation of the book and some of the points at the start, which is a very fair summation. I mean, I'm tempted to say about your question about the experience of Labour governments and then the memory of Labour governments is that one of the problems here is that the Labour Party has become more and more a member and a trade union levy paying party on the one side since the 1960s, gradually, but also faces, when it looks outwards, faces a socially and economically slightly small c conservative country, especially socially. Economically, things are a bit different. And therefore, there's this dichotomy between talking to the members or talking to the kind of policy orientated commentariat, people like us, and then talking outwards to the country. And you can see that in immigration policy again and again and again, which would be one of them, wouldn't it? With Wilson struggled, Blair struggled rather less, and now Starmer and Mahmood have struggled with talking to Labour-aligned people who might flake off to the Greens or the Liberal Democrats from the 90s onwards, but then also talking to the country, which has very, very different views. Crime and punishment is another example with Blair that we might come on to. However, I think that's just accelerated things and made it worse, the kind of dichotomy between Labour people, as it were, and the country as a whole, because it's always been there. It's always been there. So Attlee faces a kind of semi-coup. Ramsay MacDonald is absolutely hated for being a traitor and aligning himself with the Conservatives and with the National Liberals, where they kind of win in the national government. So Labour leaders are always hated in the moment. And then lo and behold, David Markend in the 70s comes along and says, oh, MacDonald wasn't so bad, or John Bew comes along in the 2000s and says, Attlee was fantastically successful in many ways, both of which there's a lot of evidence for. So there must be something wider about Labour. It's not just the members versus the people, the masses versus the classes, as it perhaps. And I think one of the things is that Labour has to do, doesn't it? Labour has to create. And Harold Wilson's famous metaphor is you have to drive the bus really, really fast, because if you stop at a lay-by, everyone gets off and starts rowing with each other. And we think Labour's civil wars now are pretty bad, but they've had some far worse. The Burnham coup is a very civilised affair, isn't it, compared to most of Labour's endless civil wars. So that's a very long academic's answer way of saying TLDR. Labour just raises hopes and tries to do. But of course, those hopes are always, always frustrated. Or always, Tony Blair evoking a young country. Well, that was me, but now I'm pretty old. So entropy and the heat death of the universe will seize you and take place anyway. I guess that's my overall answer for any radical government. And the Liberal governments of the late 19th century and early 20th century weren't any different, were they?
What I found interesting about the book is that it's a somewhat different take on the Blair years, because rather than focus on foreign policy, which of course when Blair was in office towards the end and then out of office dominated so much the way lots of people thought about Blair, certainly did when I was coming of age. And also rather than think about, say, the constitutional issues, which also still get a lot of attention in terms of their long run consequences, you choose to focus quite a lot on the management of public services. In effect, things for which governments aren't necessarily remembered 20 years on, or that aren't discussed 20 years on, but which in the short to medium term is very often what they're most judged on by the electors in terms of what is it like to live in this country under that government. So you focus on things like welfare, the economy, the NHS, education, and so on. For you, why was it particularly important to focus on these areas of policy and policy making?
That's a very good question, and the first answer is that I'm not an expert on the other areas. So the first answer is that we've all got our own specialities, we've all got our own specialisms. For those of your listeners who don't know me or have read anything by me, I've written a large amount about public services and economic policy. That's my beef, and that's my kind of tiny empire, such as it is. And so therefore, it makes sense to bring my skills to another government. I've written about Harold Wilson a lot in exactly the same frame. And so why not write about Blair in that frame? And there are lots of people who will write foreign policy and write constitutional change, which I'll come back to in a minute, far better than I would. And as a lone scholar, because this wasn't written as part of these kind of large grants that we're all supposed to be winning all the time as academics, this wasn't written as part of a team. As a lone scholar, you've only got so many days and years, and you've got to book contracts for 3 or 4 years out. So what do? You focus on what you're good at and what you know about. And what I do know about is public services. So that there's a really boring reason there. However, I think there are other reasons. And one of those reasons is that it was really the way British people experienced the Blair era. Their famous D-Ream song, and Things Can Only Get Better, did actually happen in most frames. So if you had cancer, if you had a chronic illness, the improvement in your, especially time to treatment, was absolutely phenomenal. And in the end, no one is left waiting beyond a year or beyond the 28 days to see a consultant of working days, I think. So things get phenomenally better. I've been surprised going around the country trying to hawk my book, that lots and lots of people come up to you afterwards and say, well, actually things were fantastic compared to what they'd been before, and things especially where they'd come afterwards. Give you one example is teaching assistants for school pupils with special educational needs. Or another example would be pretty much the abolition of chronic rough sleeping in some cities in England. So I also wanted to get at, someone said to me the other day, your writing is always about how people actually live, how people, what's it like? You get up and you do things and you work and you need the help of the state. What's that actually like? And I hope the book gets at that, and the answer is, for most people, things getting a lot better. We can go back to reasons for that in a minute. However, that's not to say that doesn't lead to methodological problems. Dread word, methodology, because in some ways this book, because of devolution, this book becomes about English public services and about England and about England's cities. Now, again, there's almost no other way of doing that, because there'll also be loads of books about, for instance, as you can see from my name, I come from a Northern Irish background, in part myself. I'm pretty sure that one of the major things people will say about Blair is that there was an extraordinary amount of attention to Northern Ireland. Sometimes his time almost entirely taken up by Northern Ireland. So to what extent is a book about, hospitals in southeast England really that appetite, and that there's a real a problem there? But no one is going to look at the Northern Irish peace process, which is also about Washington and Dublin a lot, and a little bit about Brussels. No one's going to look at that in a book like this. That's simply impossible. So the constitutional upheaval, which you mention, is going to be one of the ways we look back. And depending on, of course, what happens in Scotland and Wales, if these countries become independent, or if there's Irish unity within the next few decades, things will look very different to how they do now. However, it's going to look really, really important. But in the end, we can only write about, and we can only do what we can do. And I hope this is a contribution to what it was like living, for the most part, in England, although also Wales, because England and Wales, in this complex, crazy world of Britain that we've made, England and Wales is a category just the same as England is. But anyway, I did what I could do.
Skeptics of Blair, but sympathizers of Labour, might look at all of those positive social outcomes and economic outcomes that you chart in the book and ask the question, was Tony Blair necessary for all of that to happen? In other words, if John Smith hadn't died in 1994, wouldn't John Smith have probably won the 97 election? Wouldn't John Smith have tackled child poverty and reduced crime and brought down NHS waiting times? Of course, John Smith is the one who puts Tony Blair in as shadow Home Secretary and Gordon Brown in as shadow Chancellor. So what if John Smith had lived? How different would this book have been if this was a book about the Smith governments that reshaped the country?
That's another really good question, and I suppose probably I like that question because I'd be ideologically a bit closer to Smith than to Blair. So, and this is by no means a kind of hymn to the successes. Let's break that down into, firstly, there would have been a lot that's happening anyway, and that would have been the case in terms of any prime minister, even if John Major had won in 1997. So crime is plunging. It had been plunging for years, from the early to mid 1990s when it peaked, and it's continued to plunge down ever since. And there are very, very deep forces which are argued about by all sorts of people about why that is. Under Major and Clark, who'd been a very successful, I'm sure we'll all agree, even as a different political aspect to them, under Major and Clark, who'd been a very successful PM and Chancellor combo since devaluation in 92, the economy would still have been roaring ahead, and it would still have done pretty well. And not only that, but as you say, under a potential Brown government, had Tony Blair not been on the scene or not been seen as so sort of charismatic in 94, a lot of this would have happened anyway, because a lot of the initiatives on working families tax credits, on working tax credits, on child benefit, for instance, they're Brownite achievements that are driven from the Treasury, although very much approved of by Blair. So it's not a book and it's not an argument to say that this is somehow a uniquely Blairite achievement. The environment is very benign. There is growth. There are not the bond market vigilantes out there. Debt is 40%. Government debt is 40% of GDP. It's not 95%. That's a very, very different context. And it doesn't matter how much people hate Keir and Rachel. That's not going to change. Okay. So, things are a lot more difficult now. There wasn't social media. So the hatred of Starmer, the real strange, actually, hatred of Starmer partly comes from that. And Blair didn't face that, did he? So this is not to say that there's a genuine alchemy. That said, I think Blair brings to this several elements which make the political success bigger and last longer. Partly because he's able to talk in the language, assisted by Philip Gould, he talks the language of those areas in the southeast of England, outside of London, where Labour had only been able to win 2 or 3 seats all through the 80s and 90s. And he wins and continues to win, and is popular and is continuing to be popular, as I hope the book shows, in just phenomenal ahistorical ways. It's very difficult to remember after Iraq, after the Second Gulf War, that he was approaching 80% to 90% like and approval in the autumn of 1997. That's never happened. It's not happened before much. Certainly not happened since. So he's able to, I think, culminate what I call this the culmination of Labourism. He's able to culminate Labourism in rather the same way that Asquith and Lloyd George culminate liberalism in the 1910s, with a front end, not just a face man front end, but a genuine mix of philosophical arguments that say that compulsory trade union recognition is good for productivity. Right to roam in a small amount of England and Wales is good for landowners. And, we could go on and on and on, like better drug treatment and alcohol treatment for prisoners is good for you because they're less likely to offend. He's able to make those arguments in ways and touching parts of the country, like Alaga, that John Smith can't touch. Incredibly classless as he sounds, of course, to English people because of his Scottish accent and his Scottish image. There's a reason why lots of Scots are used to sell things on TV, because it feels trustworthy. My wife was born in Scotland, so I hope she's not listening. But that's praise, isn't it? And John Smith definitely had something going with that image. It's not to say it wouldn't have been a successful government, but Blair is able to bulldoze further, and he probably gets more time in office. Remember, all of those achievements that about pretty much abolishing elderly poverty and halving child poverty, they happen towards the end of term 2. So like the Blairites said, and here's where I agree with them, if you don't have power and you don't get 2 terms, there's no point. No, what's the point of building a political party, like just to be a think tank? So I think that my answer is that Smith would have lasted less long and been less dominant. But counterfactuals are very hard, and I'm sure you won't hear this from many academics. I might be wrong.
You've touched there on popularity and what was, you say, ahistorical and remarkable popularity for much of Blair's time as Prime Minister. But I sometimes think that when we look back on this period, and particularly if we remember the autumn of 1997 and that incredible spike in popularity after the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, sometimes it is seen, and you give some examples of this in the book, as if there was almost nationwide euphoria, sort of North Korean style euphoria almost at Blair coming into office. But you also point out, of course, correctly, and you write, one must be careful about overemphasizing hope and change. Only 43% of the public voted for Blair. And it's sometimes made out that when we think about Starmer at the moment, people talk about the majority that he has being very wide but shallow, in the sense that Labour did not get a very high share of the vote. But what that reminds us is that, in fact, in our system, even the biggest of majorities in the post-war period have always been won on minority vote shares.
Yeah.
And really, there's the 9% gap in vote share between what Starmer got and what in 2024 and what Blair got in 1997 is very, very significant. But it's not enough to explain all of the variation in their popularity. There were some
No.
of the factors related to that we'll come on to, but I just wonder, how do you think it was that Blair managed to turn, like you say, a minority vote share into this really lasting popularity?
Well, I think that there is a minority vote share, but on the other hand, we have to see the 1997 election also in the context of the Liberal Democrat landslide in their seats, who are very much aligned with Blair's view of the world in 1997. So you have to add, not entirely, but you have to add, strangely in your mind, some of the Lib Dem vote share. And the tactical voting, of course, is that, although it goes both ways too. And to a certain extent, because Plaid and the SNP are both in favour of devolution, they both agree that devolution can be a first step towards national self-determination, you have to add the nationalist vote to that to some extent. So I think one answer, to be fair to both Blair and Starmer, is that Blair does capture the mood and he does capture more of the vote share, even more than it looks like, because it's harder to beat the Tories when you don't have Reform UK on the pitch as well, dividing the vote across huge amounts of the country. And the Starmer landslide is partly caused by that too, but it still would have been a fairly hefty majority. Keir is never anywhere near as popular as Blair, and he's still in a negative number, I think, when he comes into power. So he's never ever got that intellectual or heft or that likability on TV. There are many, many virtues that Starmer has, and as I always say, you don't like Keir Starmer, well, be careful what you wish for. But because some alternatives can be worse. So the first thing is to say there is a genuine difference between these two elections, in that Blair does carry something more of a kind of feel of the country with him. But as I get older, and now I'm getting extremely much older, I kind of think less about left and right and about specific policy offers, which most people don't think about ever, let alone all the time. I think about good at politics, and I think about just Blair as far better, with a far lighter touch in politics than Starmer. So some of the terrible missteps that Starmer has made, and with my economics hat on, the way in which he talked down the economy and said, "Oh, everything's dreadful," in this gloomy voice in the autumn of 2024, I think that was a huge error. I don't think Blair would have made that error. I think he both did take voters seriously and showed them he was taking them seriously by talking in complex ways, by saying, yeah, the deficit's worse than we thought, but the basic economy is strong. So when Blair speaks, if you listen to the pattern, fortunately or unfortunately, I've listened to a lot of Tony, and I interviewed him for the book as well. He always speaks in this, but this, right? So it's tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime is the classic. But the example I've just given, without ventriloquizing, is the government finances are worse than we thought, but don't worry, because underlying growth will be good. And it's trusting the voters and trusting members and trusting yourself, indeed, to be complex. You must have heard Blair talk about the 1 sentence argument, the 5-minute argument, and the 10-minute argument. And he wants to get into a 5-minute or a 10-minute argument with you, just because, like Andy Burnham, by the way, he just loves arguing with people and loves talking with people. And Keir doesn't. And it is very, very clear that he doesn't really like being confronted with people. And that's a character difference that's probably way above my psychological ability to analyse. But he's clearly just a lot better in politics. And another way I would talk about that is that Blair and his team, and as he said to me, he's incredibly lucky with this team, like Andrew Adonis and David Miliband and Alistair Campbell, and all these people are really, really amazing people in their own right, and Harriet Harman and Patricia Hewitt, who we might talk about a bit later. They're really, really important. But these people were incredibly driven. And in Alistair Campbell's example, for instance, he would just get up in the morning before the sun had got up, and he'd just start thinking about how to crush the Tories, like every single day at 5 a.m. probably. And although that's not everything, that does go quite a long way. What did they call the 2001 election? Machine gunning a corpse. Well, I don't, the Tory corpse. And I just don't think Starmer's operation would bother. They'd just say, oh, well, whatever. So I think being good at politics and having a great team takes you a long way. And because we're ideas people, sometimes we don't get that. But anyway, talked a lot there. You asked me, yeah, you say as well.
The 2005 Labour manifesto has Britain forward, not back on its cover,
Right.
and it gives this impression of constant momentum moving forward. This idea you talked about with Harold Wilson, the Labour Party, is this bus you just have to keep driving. But I think with Blair, there is this even bigger sense that there are these huge external forces in the world that are constantly changing, and you need to change with them or you're going to be left behind, whether that's globalization or technological change. And in fact, in
Yeah.
one of your quotes from you have some great quotes from your interview with him, and one of them he says to you, "You've got to keep always at the cutting edge of the future. If you don't do that, you fall behind." And what is it you think that Blair means when he says you fall behind? Fall behind what? Fall behind whom? Who is he comparing
Yeah.
Britain to, or the government to, or what's this sort of kind of fear of falling behind that he's so anxious about?
Yeah, it's never clear, is it? And one way of thinking about that is that it's Britain not being at the cutting edge of what it is good at or has been good at. And we could identify computer games or film and theatre or advanced green energy or aerospace. You've got to keep your clusters running and being at the heart of a high tech economy, because there's no future, as indeed John Smith said, in being a low wage, low skill economy, because Cambodians and Vietnamese people can make all those things far, far cheaper than you can in a globalized world economy. And there's definitely a truth to that. So the first thing is that there's a kind of techno-nationalism to this, which David Edgerton, who very much dislikes Blair in the last pages of his book on the rise and fall of the British nation, as David Edgerton rightly identifies, Britain has this real techno-nationalism, which is, for instance, in the 80s, we've got to have computers in schools. Now, that happens to have been a fantastic success, but it's not always a fantastic success when you're Harold Wilson and the aluminium smelters, or for instance, or whatever else it is, or British Leyland in the early 80s. So the first thing is there's a techno nationalism. Second thing is, I think that there's got to be a sense of hope. People have got to have a sense of hope. Now, this is from me as someone who's now writing a book about ideas of the future, partly following on from this one. There's got to be a sense that things are going to get better. Otherwise, in a mostly secular society, and of course Blair is not a secularist, he's a big believer in private. In a secular society, what is it that government gives you if it's not a better life? If it's not the hope, at least, that in Blair's example, your children will go to university and they might get a white-collar professional job, which is a fantastic dream of the post-war era that in this time expands enormously. So the second answer is that it's about hope. It's about offering people a future. And what does Keir Starmer really offer you as hope? I'm not sure. I mean, I think he probably offers you a country that's more secure, but he just lacks the political skills to stay on that theme. Whereas Blair and Alistair Campbell and the others, remember, they just say, unless you're sick of saying the same thing over and over again, you've not said it enough. So you might be sick of Blair talking about the future and the internet, but most voters have only heard that 3 times. So because they only listen to news by about 12 minutes a day or something, less probably. So the second thing is you're offering people hope. I think, however, that there's a more messianic or even eschatological kind of rhetoric to this, isn't there? And that Blair is, in some senses, that private eye sketch of him, which is very cruel as the vicar. He's also a preacher, because he's, for instance, I talk about this in the book, not purely from a Roman Catholic point of view, I should point out, but he's a closet Catholic who doesn't want to come out because he thinks it will make a fuss, and it's private, quite rightly, and he definitely sees the world in that fashion of travelling towards city of God, an Augustinian way of seeing the world, in that the world's going to be better. The world offers you something which goes back to hope. The Labour Party also has always had to be futurist. Wilson promised you a technological future. And in many ways, as I've said, till I'm sick of saying, he was just ahead of his time. So there you are in the late 60s after devaluation saying, oh, come on, Harold, communication satellites and containerization, and data webs and data storage. They're not going to cut it. They're not going to be the future economy. Well, it turns out Harold was right. So the Labour Party's got to be a party of the future, because otherwise, what does it offer you? It just offers you some of that crazy Al Khan stuff, like the Labour Party is a party of factories and mines. Well, it hasn't been that for many decades.
If you were to pour some cold water over Blair's achievements, I think one of
Yeah.
the lines that I would have taken out of your book, one of the themes I would have taken out of your book,
Which
is that he just gets incredibly lucky with the economy on at least three fronts. So he gets a very good inheritance, which you've already mentioned. He happens to be in power when there's this general moderation of the monetary situation globally, relatively low inflation period. And there's also the credit boom that's making a lot of people feel good. And for Blair, he's off the scene by the time it explodes, and Brown and his successors are there picking up some of the mess. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the lines in your book that I think really brings that to the fore is you quote Nick McPherson as talking
Yeah.
about the tax intake quite early on in the government, and basically saying they're almost embarrassed by how much money they've got coming in because of just how good the economic picture is looking. And I couldn't help but think, as I read that if you said that to Keir Starmer, then he would basically say, well, this is so, or Rachel Reeves, this is so fundamental to the context in which we're governing, the situation in the economy. And we could do what Blair had done if only we had consistent 2.5%, 3% growth, if only we had, as you mentioned before, the lower debt to GDP ratio, if it was just a much more benign economic situation, then we could do all these great things too. But it isn't, so we can't. To what extent do you think the benign economy helps explain some, most, or even all of Blair's successes in government?
I'm going to go for some there. I'm going to go for the choice of some, choice A, bullet point A, because I think it does explain some of this, and it's very important. And I don't resolve for a moment from what you've said, in that there is that nice economy. However, I think there are a number of things I would say about that. The number one is that the UK does better than others. Its productivity goes up faster than most of the OECD, and it catches some of its competitors and it passes them. And although that's perhaps coming from a low bar after the chaos of the 70s and 80s economically, that's still significant, and it means they're doing something right. Now, I happen, as your kind of communal garden social democrat, think that that's about the forward planning that they're doing. It's about the independence of the Bank of England. It's about increased stability of interest rates. And it's also about the comprehensive spending reviews and the public sector agreements of 3 to 5 years ahead. So effectively, markets can see exactly where you are, exactly where you're going, exactly what you're doing. And by the way, it's also about spending on those public services, which definitely has an economic payback. As anybody from Labour or the Liberals in the 20th century will tell you, better educated, but healthier workforce, better growth. And I think that taking all those factors together, it's not just about the environment. The UK does better than the others. It is coming up from a low base, so there is a catch-up and convergence factor where in the globalised economy everybody will move together, but equally there are some, unless we fall into complete despair, there are definitely some policy wins in what Labour does. It makes Labour more expensive, for instance, through the minimum wage and through more worker-friendly conditions, and therefore aids in automation, and we got some evidence on that as well. If we come to the credit boom, the third, I think, of your points, there's no doubt that financialisation, particularly financialisation of the housing market, does lead to a real problem and ends in the bust. But we need to be very clear in that the implosion of the credit market and the financial markets is located inside not the UK housing market, although it's exposed to it, but inside the US housing market, inside the credit bundling of the US credit market and the misguided attempt of the government to massively, what we now would think of as missell mortgages to American consumers. And that leads to the meltdown on Wall Street in 2008. This crisis does not originate with the Northern Rock crisis and the UK mortgage market, which has got much more moderate difficulties. It originates in New York, and it transmits itself to London because London is so integrated into that system. Now, that was probably unwise. The UK, like Canada or Sweden, should have had many more circuit breakers in place. However, of course, it had not had a banking crisis, unlike Canada or Sweden in recent memory in the 90s. So therefore, it is to some extent understandable why it was so exposed. Now, so that's dealt with, that's growth and that's credit. They made a load of mistakes, but also I think there were successes in terms of economic policy. There's no doubt, for instance, in our counterfactual, to go back to counterfactuals, that had Major and Clark won the 97 election, there would not have been independence. There would have been a continued, probably, premium on UK bonds and higher interest rates than they needed to be. And there would have been a plethora of tax cuts, like, for instance, in the Irish situation in the Celtic Tiger economy. And that would not have helped the economy to grow in the same sustainable manner it grew, again, really with another surge, even after the dot-com boom and bust. So a very, very long and technical economist's answer to your question is, I think that the environment was benign, but they didn't mess it up. And also they made it a bit better than it would have been. Plus, if politics is anything, it's about being a lucky general. So I don't mind following people who are really lucky. So maybe that's the lesson.
You've touched upon some of those economic judgments that governments and parties have to make. And sometimes when we look back, there is often a big judgment, which at the time might look like it's perfectly reasonable, but quite soon afterwards is exposed as not being. I sometimes think on the Conservative side, for example, that David Cameron's embrace of a more liberal version of conservatism from 2005 onwards can look like a perfectly reasonable approach to get the Conservatives back into government. But you fast forward another decade or so, and suddenly it looks like it misread the mood of the right of politics and arguably some of the country beyond. It strikes me that the big judgment that Blair made was about globalization and not just accepting globalization as the inevitable background to which governments at this time were operating, but really rather embracing it as well and seeing it as a good thing for Britain. Again, if we fast forward a couple of decades, and if we think in particular, say, about what happened in the COVID-19 pandemic, there are ways in which you can see a dependence upon a globalized economy and a dependence upon specializing on what you do well and depending upon others to do what they do well can suddenly look kind of blindingly naive. I wonder what you make of the criticism that the Blair government gambled to some degree on the world economy continuing to open up and didn't fully appreciate the way in which the country would be exposed if, in fact, it's somewhat closed down.
I think you're right. You're absolutely right in that Blair embraced globalization. He didn't just say that it was something to be dealt with, as you rightly say. What does he say to the Parliamentary Labour Party? It's worse than you think. I really believe this stuff. And he's actually, he's a proselytizer for globalization. But there are reasons for this. One reason goes back to what I always call actually existing Labourism, which is that despite a lot of its intellectuals, for instance, in the 70s, being quite autarkic, the Labour Party in office has always been a free trade party, and indeed was a free trade party when it was allied with the Liberals in the Edwardian period. The GATT round, the GATT itself, and the GATT rounds like the Uruguay round and the Kennedy round were all enthusiastically pushed by Labour governments of the time. So the idea that Labour wasn't a free trade party is kind of slightly for the birds, and this isn't new. However, what is new is the keenness for it and the kind of evangelical selling of it. And also, I think what we call globalisation is something more than merely reducing tariffs on goods, which is what Labour had always been in favour of. It's always been a free trading party. One has to remember the intellectual context, I think, and it can be, or only can be, a little bit unfair to all politicians to say, well, 20 years afterwards, it didn't look so great. Well, who's the Nostradamus, right? And at the time, with China's entry into the WTO, these forces did look unstoppable. And by the way, they're still there. I don't think that the much talked about deglobalization is vastly yet constitutively as significant nearly as the globalization, because we still see what closing the Straits of Hormuz does to the pound in your pocket or in your wallet or in your purse, to coin a phrase. So I think Blair is in many ways proven to be correct about globalization, because it's still there and it's still going long after he left office. The intellectual context, and here I'm going to mention Anthony Giddens, who appears quite a lot in the book, who to some extent I think is Blair's slightly forgotten guru or most important thinker, Giddens argues that globalization should massively benefit the left in new left terms, because what will happen is people will begin to be able to come into themselves, to self-actualize in the kind of wonky jargon of the time. They'll become more able to have fantastic technicolor lives, the kind of lives Tony Crossland talked about as a revisionist in the 50s. So you've got to think yourself back really into the context of the globalization, which looked so fantastic when the third way was in full flow. Because remember, the centre left, they win in France, they win in Germany, the communist threat has fallen apart. The centre left, they win in the US under Clinton. It looks like the surge of the moment that you can have growth without inflation. Because remember, what had the right said for 25 years? Social democracy will lead to increased deficits, increased money creation, money stream, and therefore inflation. If that's not true, if globalization can reduce inflation and make inflation fall while growth increases, then what's not to like? It's happy days. However, I do want to emphasize that I'm talking about a deeper globalization. It's a social and intellectual globalization that might allow you to do anything. Remember, Blair had spent a year as a waiter in Paris learning his French himself. And he was thinking, isn't it amazing that young people can go backpacking in Thailand? Isn't it incredible that you can go to Prague when you couldn't go to Prague when I was, growing up? And there's a real emotional heft of globalization in this period that kind of people who live in the period of war in Ukraine and threats of war over Taiwan, we can really miss that, I think.
So one of the focuses in the book, and one of the sort of cited achievements of the New Labour government is fixing the NHS, bringing down waiting times, and improving a whole range of health outcomes. At the same time, there was criticism made that there was a kind of target culture in public services and in the health service in particular, that I think, one of you can say targets are very helpful in driving change and achieving outcomes, but also people argue that these sometimes would miss the wood for the trees, or that there would just be this focus on how do we massage what we're doing in certain ways so that we have the headline big figure, but actually it's actually not quite as robust when you dig down. So what's your view, both from the book and also from your wider body of work, about the target culture in the New Labour years, and particularly with reference to the NHS?
I think what's very interesting about the target culture is that that's the thing that we always think of and remember. And that's often the social memory inside these services for people who are old enough to have worked there in the 90s and 2000s. But really, New Labour didn't take long to abandon a lot of these targets because of the perverse incentives that they injected. So if you've got a time cutoff for being seen in A&E, lo and behold, everybody's seen after, if it's 4 hours, everybody's seen after 3 hours and 50 minutes. If you drive cancer treatment, people with non-cancer treatment waiting lists, they stagnate while the cancer list waiting lists go down. If you set people incentives, they will run ever faster for those incentives. And I know this because I'm an academic and I work in a sector full of metrics where increasingly what the point of the service is lost in the storm of the metrics, right? And what's actually interesting about New Labour is there are two New Labour ideas. Idea A is there'll have to be central targets because we need to squeeze the money more and we need to sweat the assets more. Perfectly reasonable if you have no money. But as time goes on and there's more money, what I think we find is much more emphasis on quasi-markets. And I think my criticism of New Labour would not be so much the targets, which they move on from quite quickly. And they for instance, widen enormously the basket of targets and they become aspirations in NHS, which is a much better way of handling it with my kind of managerial hat on. I think my criticism would be the hyper embrace when it was clear that Blair was going in term 3 of really, really advanced quasi markets where you were expected to choose a surgeon with your GP, for instance. And Julian Legrand, who's one of the big academic figures who's very, very keen on these sorts of ideas, says, well, that's okay because there'll have to be an NHS advisory service that will help every single patient kind of work with this. Now, actually, that's a Labour idea too, because that's what Michael Young said about, consumer advice in the 1951 manifesto. But equally, it's got a lot of downsides. And I've actually, talking of books, I've been reading the book of our new Northern Kings
Yes.
by Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham. And Andy Burnham was a health minister during the New Labour years. And he says, one of the things we lost with quasi markets and contracting out, although the evidence is that, for instance, you got your knee operation or your shoulder operation more quickly, one of the things we lost was a sense of actually being in the NHS and working for the NHS, because lots of people, like the porter or the secretary or the person on the desk, they really got lots psychologically out of working there, and therefore were willing to take lower salaries. So that is kind of, sometimes you lose things as well as gain things from these hypermarkets that I've gone on to talk about, I think.
You write in the book about education, and I think education policy, I always think, is really important to understanding New Labour. I think in part because I think you can see the focus on education as linking to Blair's socialism, if it's right to call it socialism at all, as being about opportunity in large part, rather than just imposing equality on people. And focusing on education as a ladder, I think, is a really effective way of doing that. Now, some say today that there's a consensus between Blair and Tory reformers like Michael Gove on education, more than there is between Blair and his own party. Why do you think it is? Well, first of all, tell me if you think that's not true. But why do you think it is that Blair's party don't really seem to want to embrace his record in education, except for highlighting the additional investment and what that was able to achieve?
Well, we need to differentiate between ends and means here. Now, I think that Gove and Blair do come together on effectively saying that schools should be self-governing. And again, we're talking about schools in England, and we're talking mainly about secondary schools, because the analysis Blair would have of the 70s and 80s is that mostly inner city kids had been let down by local education authorities who had failed on a series of metrics and for a series of reasons which we don't have time to go into. And although I'm not talking for these people, Michael Gove pretty much agrees with that. So there is convergence between the Blairites and the liberal conservatives, remember, like Gove, who is still a liberal conservative on these issues. There is convergence on those on governance questions. But I don't think there's convergence at all on what goes on within those schools. Because remember, what was New Labour trying to get those self-governing schools to do? It was more music, more art, more theatre, more sport, which they shared with John Major. And that's not Gove's emphasis at all. Gove's emphasis is, for instance, in my subject, history, where did Europe start and where has it got to in a chronological manner? So there's a big divergence remains on the ends. And of course, the ends are also a big divergence on higher education. Now, which I'm sorry to bore on about, but that's also an important part of the picture, which is, if you look at the Blair Institute now, they're still saying, and I agree with this, higher education needs to expand massively, and there should be a campus in every town, and everybody should go to university all the time. Now, that's a kind of extreme way of putting it, but I certainly sympathise with some of that view, and that's not what the Liberal Conservatives think of at all. In fact, if we look at the recent output of Policy Exchange, they're saying we need a cap to come back on, and only about 30% of people, or a bit more, 35%, should go to university. And that there should be, of course, they say there should be other education streams for other people. So although governing schools is something they do agree on, and of course David Cameron helps him, doesn't he, pass the school bill and makes a big thing of it, which Kemi Badenoch should learn from. Constructive opposition will get voters on your side. There isn't a convergence on the point of education. And I think you're right about, I'd probably say Blair's social democracy, or perhaps Christian socialism, rather than socialism per se. It becomes his way of replacing welfare and economic controls, because he doesn't think that they will stand up to the gale of globalisation, which is inevitable. He says, you might as well stand up. So you might as well say that you don't want autumn to follow summer, that you don't want globalisation. And what have you got to do to that? There's a strategy, and the strategy is the British people will stand up to this because they'll be better educated. Now, whatever you think of that strategy, and I think it's got lots of problems, at least it is a strategy. And I would struggle to divine Bridget Phillipson's and Keir Starmer's strategy, except for they want kids from non-traditional backgrounds to do better, and they're making some progress on that. But that's not a macro strategy that fits in with everything else. This was also a political strategy which said, hey, middle-class people, I understand your aspirations, and by the way, this is how we'll get more equality. Remember earlier I said he could reach the parts Blair other politicians couldn't reach? Well, this is another way of doing it. This is just like, I'm going to send you to prison longer, but I'm going to be soft about it and you'll get more help when you get out. It's the either or yes but answer which takes people seriously and takes their children seriously, I suppose.
Most of the areas of policy that we've talked about so far, the economy, welfare reform, the NHS, education, crime, these are all areas where uh, if people are taking, as you do in the book, a, a non-hostile look at the Blair governments, there are clear measurable achievements that are made.
Mm.
One area which is, I think, much weaker when we look at the policy legacy of the Blair government is on housing. And of course, you have the global financial crisis at the end of the Blair government, which is partly about housing in the United States. But there is also this story about how new stock is not being built to keep up with demand, that this pushes up asset prices for owners, but makes it harder for younger generations to get onto the housing ladder, that there really isn't much interest at all in social housing by the new Labour government. So why was that? Why did the new Labour government seem to take its eye off the ball on housing? And are there any particular successes that you think are worth reflecting on from that time when it comes to housing?
Well, house building does rise, as we see, up until the financial crisis. And indeed, even though social housing is not a priority, social housing, although housing associations, not councils, that also does rise. So there's not an entirely, although I am very critical of this, the record in housing, this is not an entirely a nurgatory. It's not. There are things on the move. And of course, one of the things that the left really, really wants from a Labour government, which is to make it much harder to buy your council house, which reduces the social housing stock and usually gives it to private landlords, that's made much, much more difficult by this government. So again, there are certain Brownite and even kind of Burnhamite, Starmerite kind of emphases here. It's not all just a story of not building, but the problem is that building more houses, which is what May and Johnson and Sunak also found, is very, very complex, especially in England, and very, very hard. Now, we could do it. There's any number of studies showing the amount of land that's accessible near tube stations and commuter train stations in the southeast of England, and we could build hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of units. And there is an attempt to do that, and it's the Thames Gateway, which is connected, of course, to the Olympics bid. So again, it's not entirely a null record. But to break through the planning system, when one of your political aims is to ally yourselves with the middle classes who have a liberal outlook, and also to break through it when the resistance in the local authority system is so powerful, is really, really hard. And by the way, the construction industry's productivity and building record is not fantastic either, something that Harold Wilson had also run into. So I think, to be honest, the answer is that it's really, really hard. And that's a surprise, because you would have thought that a third way government would do pretty well in a sector of the economy and social policy, which is very third way. You know, you've got 60 to 70% of owner occupiers, but the rest of the population are in a mix of other private renting, and they're also in social housing. I think so. It's difficult. It's hard. This is really, really hard. It's much harder than getting the NHS to function when you throw a bucket of money on it and you make it more flexible. I think that also there are successes which the British state, for want of a better phrase, is comfortable with, which is the regeneration of the private letted sector. Remember that for decades after the Second World War, the private letted sector had been a disaster area. And had been really what you got when you couldn't get a council house, which was seen as by far preferable. Like my mum's council house there in West London, in Hounslow, in the 50s. and that she grew up in, because it was a pretty good house and the private rental options were far worse. So there was also this idea that the rejuvenation of private letting, because it was so attractive to investors, particularly like, small fish investors, that had been a success, which to some extent I think it had. So there were successes, there were attempts, but I just think this is too difficult to unlock. And it means that what you get is a kind of residual welfare policy, which is getting rid of homelessness and rough sleeping, where they do have an enormous amount of success as time goes on. But that's not a housing market success. What you have to do is what, to their credit, Keir and Rachel have tried to do, which is massively increase your building rate and to smash through the planning obstructions. Remember, though, again, people aren't going to like that. So even though you might like these solutions, it doesn't mean they're politically that comfortable.
We're coming to our last couple of questions now, and
Sure.
for me, one of the things that I took from your book, which I guess I'd sort of also been coming to in my own mindset, perhaps reflecting on my increasing comparisons between the Blair government and the current Labour government, is the degree to which Tony Blair was more of a pluralist within Labour Party terms than I had perhaps appreciated when I was a precocious teenager. And you talk about in the book how he had an ability to tolerate what I think he called sensible radicals.
Yeah.
He had voices from the left like Michael Meacher, Claire Shaw, Robin Cook, Chris Mullin, Tony Banks as government ministers. And he even goes so far to suggest that at the end of his government in 2007, there were only just a couple of proper Blairites round the cabinet table. You single out John Reid and John Hutton. So I wonder if you could reflect on that. Is that something that, Blair felt he had to do because he realized that the Labour Party is a coalition and you have to hold together this unwieldy coalition? Was it that Blair believed that it was somewhat intellectually stimulative to have people from different perspectives in the party? Am I overstating the extent now? Have I gone the other way and overstated the extent to which he is a pluralist? What's your sort of take on that?
There are lots of reasons why he's a pluralist. One is one of temperament, which is, to be honest, a little bit like Thatcher. He wants you to have a row with him, and he wants you to have a tussle and a push and pull. And if you just cave in as a minister, you're probably not going to make it. So there is an enjoyment of politics there, and an enjoyment of an intellectual argument. And if you're well briefed, he might well say, "Oh, I think I'm coming round to your point of view." There's also increasingly, and this happens to all prime ministers, he's got the big picture. So what he wants is Britain to be internationally competitive while most people are looked after and there's not great holes in the welfare state. And he wants the maintenance of both the European alliance and the American alliance. You imagine that's your big picture, right? That's very much like a lot of other prime ministers. A lot of other stuff, like I've written about the right to roam with Michael Meacher. Michael Meacher just sells that to Blair by saying, look, a general right to roam, rather than giving legislative kind of force to each little area, that will take this controversy off our backs straight away, because it will give it to the Ordnance Survey and the local councils and they'll have to do it. So if you can sell it to Blair and it's something that is politically looks good, then why not? And actually, I think that the extent to which he's not a leftist is crazily exaggerated by his left opponents. Now, of course, he's not a strong leftist, but it's often said, although I'm not sure the evidence is 100% there for this, that it's Blair who saves Jeremy Corbyn from deselection, because he says, let 1,000 flowers bloom. If the members there are going to get rid of him, they'll get rid of anybody. And he respects the far left thread as a particular thread, a very honourable thread within the Labour family, and he does see it as a family. I think that people who went to he could have joined the Social Democrats in 82, 83, and he didn't. And people who join the Social Democrats do see things very differently to Blair. And like Hattersley, someone else, he's just passed away, hasn't he? Like Hattersley, who just decides, I'm just going to stick with Labour. And like Healey, he sees the Labour Party as the only practical, progressive, forward-thinking. We used that futurist terminology, didn't we? Forward-thinking force in the country. So you've got to use all parts of it, and maybe sometimes the left are right, the left are correct. This is also a dual monarchy, isn't it? So he's got to take account of Brown, except for that very brief period after the 2001 election. He can't sack Brown, so he has to just take account of Brown, which is basically a new Labour with a bit more of a left inflection, a kind of Ed Miliband kind of view of the world, which seems to be quite, it seems to be that it's going to become the major force under Burnhamism, whatever Burnhamism becomes. So there's a whole slew of reasons. It's personality, it's character, it's political analysis, it's seeing Labour as, you've got to manage Labour. Wilson had loads of people who absolutely hated his guts round the cabinet table. Well, such is life. And is there anybody listening to this podcast who loves everybody that they meet in the course of their working days? I suspect that there is not.
You quote Peter Hennessy on the 1945-51 Labour government, his now perhaps semi-famous words, in which he says that Britain by the end of that government was kinder, gentler, and a far better place in which to be born, to grow up, to live, love, work, and even to die. Such an epitaph cannot be placed with conviction on the plinths of any of the eras to come. Now, I have my issues with Hennessy's comment for what it's worth. He forgot to say whether it was a better time to buy sugar or bread at the shops, well, never mind.
It's a cheap shop.
But nevertheless, it speaks to the way in which we see Attlee and the Attlee government as building a new Jerusalem, indulging in whichever little cliche we may wish. And part of that, of course, is that the Attlee government creates new institutions which become very important fabrics to British society and British politics, of course, most notably the NHS. There isn't really, in my view, comparable institutional creations in the New Labour years. Certainly not in England. Of course, there's devolution, which we've skirted. But in England, it doesn't seem that there's something comparable to that. So I wonder, almost 2 decades on from Blair leaving office, in terms of the areas that you focus on, how do you think his legacy can still be felt in this country?
Oh, I think it's undeniable, and indeed his enemies who hate him so much of left and right, they kind of accept that by their constant attacks on him, don't they? And I'll give you a number of examples. If we set devolution aside, which, as we've already said, we shouldn't, and I think that's going to be the situation in Northern Ireland is just far, far, far better than it would have been without the peace process. Now, that peace process comes up from within Northern Ireland, but Blair runs with it, he seizes it, he runs with it, and that there probably wouldn't have been a settlement of that ilk in that year without both him and Bertie Ahern. However, there are lots of other elements I could look at. We can see, I think, in the data that inequalities rise, although it had slowed, is now stopped, because the attack on poverty is so successful that it even slows the advance of inequality to a crawl, and then it stops. And remember, it's part of our kind of collective mythic knowledge that inequality is rising and has been rising for decades, and it hasn't. It hasn't really risen since the 90s. However you slice it, top 10, bottom 10, bottom 10, bottom 20, top 20, whatever, right? So there is a sense that. There is also a sense, and I think this is again another parallel with Wilson, that there's a social liberalisation that is not reversible, unlike the reverse of some of the social liberalisation we've seen in the United States on campuses or in schools or in laws governing kind of sexual or gender or moral, so-called moral factors. There is a sense in which, for instance, through civil partnerships, or for instance, through the way Blair talks about single-parent families, which is very different from the way the Conservatives have talked about them, there is a way in which the real Britain that actually exists, which is full of blended families, and all the people listening will have loads of different types of blended family, that these are now accepted. And I don't think that's like a lobster pot. You can't shove that back through the pot, much as Reform UK and increasingly the Conservatives might want to. But even at the minutiae level, we think of lots of the policy having been disassembled. So rough sleeping gets loads worse again, unfortunately. However, we've still got the minimum wage, and the minimum wage has been such a massive success that I think its success is almost played out, because it's pushing the wages at the bottom up against the middle. And therefore, we're now coming to the end of what we can successfully do with the minimum wage. We've still got minimum wage. We've still got really tax credits for working families. It's just that they've all been rolled into universal credit. And we saw George Osborne try and attack that and try and reduce it. He got nowhere, because nearly, more than a third of people on UC are working, and they say, hang on, you're going to price me out of a job. What the hell are you doing? And they go on TV and they say this, and then voters run a mile, quite rightly, by the way. So we've still got lots of the element of the Blair settlement, the social liberalism, the way in which we support wages at the bottom end, the minimum wage, devolution. So, and by the way, the idea of regional devolution within England, which now under Burnham will probably now gather pace. Although Blair wasn't particularly enthusiastic about that, he wasn't particularly against John Prescott's ideas in that sphere either. So although not so transformative as an Attlee or a Thatcher, I certainly think that this is a kind of a medium level. If we talk of 3 levels of transformation, this is a level 2 transformation of British society and its political economy. Not all is gain, by the way, of course. And of course, the use of CCTV, I probably would say, was not a gain, or the idea of biometric ID cards, a lot of your listeners will be sceptical about. But certainly many, many of the ideas, especially because the Blair Institute is one of the only powerful think tanks broadly in the centre or on the left, many, many ideas just continue to come back to these Blair and Brown, and I stress Brown, ideas. So he's not gone anywhere yet, as you can see from his appearances in the media.
Well, Glen, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. The book is New Labour, New Britain: How the Blair Government Reshaped the Country. Glen, thanks so much.